Do you ever struggle to achieve loose, flowy watercolor and yet also realistic detail in your work? Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. My name is Jessica, and today I'm going to be sharing my favorite 3 techniques that are super basic and yet can transform your work. I'm going to be using the petals on this flower to demonstrate those techniques today. But be sure to stay tuned because in the near future I'll be posting the rest of this tutorial. Throughout the video, I'm also going to share some examples of my own work just so you can see how versatile these techniques really are. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first way to get soft edges is probably the one you're most familiar with, and that's the one watercolor is really known for, and that's wet on wet. So if you work wet on wet, you'll automatically get soft edges. So to work wet on wet, you just go ahead and fill your shape in, whatever shape that is where you're wanting your nice soft edges, with clear water or water that's slightly tinted. I've got slightly tinted water because I've got a little bit of pigment on my brush here, and that's allowing you to see where I'm applying my water, but I'm really just applying it over this whole flower shape here. And most often I will work with just clear water, but usually having a small amount of pigment on your brush or in your water is totally fine because you're going to be applying so much more color after this that you're likely not wanting anything to be perfectly white. But if you do, you definitely want to use just perfectly clear water here. And then you are going to grab one of your paints. And in this case, I'm picking up my yellow and I'm going to drop it in the center of this flower to kind of get the center nice and bright to start with. And I will come in and refine things a little bit more after, but you can see how wherever that water is, that paint just wants to kind of flow right out and we're getting a nice soft edge. Then I'm going to grab this kind of coral color here that I've made by mixing my yellow and my quinacridone rose together. And I'm going to apply that around the edges of my flower. And once again, you're going to see the beautiful effect of nice wet on wet techniques. I've almost got too much water down here, so I'm just going to soak that up and dab it on a paper towel. It's okay to have really wet, flowy paint if you want it that way, but sometimes if it's too wet, it can kind of almost get funny edges for you. So if you feel like you're getting puddles, you can just soak them up with a thirsty brush. And I'm going to go ahead and do a few little lines kind of radiating towards the center of this flower just to give the impression of maybe having a little bit of creases or folds here. This is optional. You don't have to add texture at this layer or any details, but because I can, I'm going to, but you definitely don't have to. Let's go around and just quickly finish the edge of this, and then we're going to let this dry. Because our next 2 techniques require a dry surface, but there's also another reason we want to dry this, and I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. Once again, I'm just going to throw a few little details, just almost like I say, lines radiating out from the center because I can. And sometimes how well those little details work at this stage is really dependent on how wet your paper is. You can see where I'm really, really wet. I have a little bit less detail, and that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. While this is drying, I want to show you some examples of how I would apply wet on wet techniques in my own work. Here's an example where the wet on wet technique, it works especially well. Here's some very large shapes to the petals of this flower, and you can see just that very soft, gentle change in color that's happening here. You can see that very softly happening here. You can see that soft transition again in here. Over here as it's going from that darker pink to the lighter pink. And it's a technique I use all the time in my work. Here's a smaller example, but once again, you can clearly see that wet on wet and the variations that I'm able to achieve in the color. The wet on wet technique is really helpful for getting these beautiful washes laid in and filling in and really blocking out the major shapes of this rose. Now this is still wet, so I'm going to share with you the reason why I don't want to go ahead and add any more detail to this yet, because we're going to have problems with the colors kind of turning into mud if we touch this while it's still wet. We'll also get some blooms and other crazy things happening, but I'm just going to explain this to you from the standpoint of color. So what I've gone ahead and done here is I've made a strip of this coral color. I've actually made it with a little bit of my coral and yellow together, so I had a nice kind of orangey color here. And so I'm going to go ahead and paint, this one's dry. I'm going to go ahead and paint another one so that it is wet. I'm just going to grab my brush and I'm going to try and aim for the same color. Now I am working with this coral color, but I did, like I say, I put a little bit of yellow in it too because I wanted it to be just a little bit more of like an orangey color. So let's just get that on there and we'll throw a bit of yellow in with it and we'll see if we can kind of get this little swatch looking kind of the same as the last one. So I definitely need a little bit more of my coral in here because we're too too orange. Let me just soak a little bit of that out with my paper towel. Just try and aim for something about the same. Now it does dry lighter too, so I don't want to like get too light. I can lighten a bit, but if I lighten too much, it will dry a bit lighter. So getting a perfect color match when one is wet and one is dry is a little bit more challenging here, but we're just gonna go ahead, put that on there, and then I'm gonna go and add a little bit of our shadow color to both of these. And I want you to see the difference that it makes by having a dry surface to work on versus the wet painting. So I've got here, this is the color I'm going to be using for my shadow, and I'll just show you a little sample of it on here because we are going to be using it later. It's kind of a pinky purple, and that's what I'm going to use to start my shadow. I'll probably drip a little bit of the other blues in here as well, but I'm going to take some of this along with some water on my brush. I don't want to be too dark at first, and I'm going to go ahead and just put a strip of this color right across my coral color like this. Add a bit of water to this as well so that you can kind of see through the colors. And there you have a nice color, really. Here, I'm going to come and do the same thing. I'll just leave a little space. Sorry, I shouldn't have put that little drip there. Anyways, I'm going to do the same thing here while this one is still wet. And you're going to see the difference that it makes to do this in a wet section versus a dry section. Right away, you can see the colors are actually mushing together. And the colors don't look too bad in this particular situation, just because the colors are close enough together on the color wheel. There's kind of maybe a little bit more muddiness in this one, but most definitely things are flowing together. This is wet enough that the effect is still pretty, but let me go ahead and make a purple that's even darker, and you'll get a better feel for what's happening here if we go too crazy with our shadows. So I'm going to grab this slightly deeper purple. So I'm just adding a little bit of blue to my pink color here. I'm going to do the same thing once again, and you can see that nice purple color on top, and it works okay as a shadow because that color underneath is kind of shining through, if you will. We're not making mud. Let's take a little bit more of it and do the same thing here. And now this, you can see automatically, we are getting a more muddy color than what we have here, right? And so this is a bonus tip that I think every beginner needs to know when they work wet on wet. It can be helpful to keep your contrasting shadow colors for a separate layer to avoid mud. Here's an example where you can definitely see I've laid in that nice, beautiful, warm undertone first. And then, as you can tell, I've got so many cool colors, and yet there's still a beautiful warmth around the sun, and things haven't really turned too muddy, have they? You can definitely see they're a little bit neutralized, and yet being able to put that yellow on first and then add those other cool colors on top really helps this have that beautiful effect of like a sunset in the winter. This pansy is one of my favorite paintings, and you can definitely see how my having put that yellow in first. I've got this kind of golden neutral yellow, just a little bit dull, but laid that in everywhere first and then let it dry, and that allowed all that yellow to kind of like lock in before I started adding all these beautiful purples and reds on top. You might have picked up on the yellow in this painting I showed you earlier, but clearly you can see once again, there are some beautiful yellow undertones here, and yet I've been able to generally avoid the look of mud because of the way that I've laid my color on and then let things dry. The same thing here. There's clearly yellow undertones happening here, but by laying those yellows on first, letting it dry, we can avoid muddy color. If you're enjoying today's video, I'd love to invite you to join my free newsletter. In it, you'll find creative inspiration, art tips, studio updates, as well as be the first to know about workshops and lessons. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can sign up at the link in the description below. Now let's get back to painting. So now that everything is dry, we're going to be working wet on dry, but we're going to be using water to soften the edges. So to start out, I'm grabbing a little bit of my color for my shadows, which I have over here. It's kind of a purple pink color. And I also have a brush with water on it that I'm going to be using for softening my edges. So I'm going to come in here first and just come along the edge of these little stamen here, and I'm going to just create what we have as a hard edge. I'm going to talk about hard edges more in a minute, but I'm just going ahead and filling that in with my brush. Then I'm grabbing the water brush that I have here, so I've got the paintbrush and the water brush, and I'm just softening the edge of that and blending it around. So I'm going to come in with the water, just drag that around a little bit, and then come wash and dry my brush and drag that color upwards, and you can see how I've kind of got a nice soft edge along there. I'm going to put a little bit more pigment just because I'm not quite happy with the texture I'm getting, and I'm also going to try and create a little bit of linear motion in here, which is optional, but it does start to give us the impression that we have some creases and folds happening. Let's go ahead up here. There's some more shadows that I want to capture. So I'm coming in, it's still dry up here, and I'm going to come and put those shadows in. So, and then once again, take the water brush and just soften the edge. Like I say, you do need to work fairly fast when you're using this technique, but it can give you more control, and it might be a technique that you find really helpful. I'm gonna go ahead, and you can see we're getting a little bit of the wet on wet soft edges here because it's wet here, it's dry up here. So now we're getting a hard edge up here. Once again, I can grab my water brush and come and just gently soften that edge. And so you're seeing a combination of effects happening here. We're getting soft edges both by having the wet on wet, and then we have wet on dry, and then we soften that edge. Let's go ahead and put some more shadow over here. I am looking at a reference photo to kind of guide me a little bit as I do this. Soften this edge along here. And you can see anytime that I take a little bit too long to come back in with my wet brush, I can start to get a little bit of a hard edge that doesn't disappear. And we're going to talk about that because sometimes you do want a hard edge that doesn't disappear. But there we have our soft edges, and you can even come in where you've already gone, and it is wet now, so we are kind of working wet on wet, and just deepen that a little bit, then come in again with your clean brush and just soften that edge, soften that edge. So this is where having a clean, sort of wet, slightly damp brush is going to help you get some nice edges and help with water control if you're wanting to work with more detail or get more detail. Let's talk about hard edges now. Down in this section of the flower, I'm going to go ahead and put these shadow shapes. Now, this has a very defined hard edge here, and then it kind of comes in like so, and I am looking at my photo to kind of see how my shadow shapes are working, and they are very hard edged. There's no real softness there. The only thing I could do is just lighten it if I don't want those colors to be quite so dark. And there we have a nice hard edge. We have not gone around. The only time I've used my water brush is just to soak a little bit of paint out, but I haven't actually softened the edge. Does that make sense? I see another shadow down here, again, hard edge. So I'm coming in directly with my paint and just leaving that shadow on there like so. Then in a few places, I'm seeing a bit of a soft shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of that on there, then grab my clean damp brush and just gently soften the edge of that, and just kind of work my way away from that center shape there. And you can see I've got a nice soft edge, but I had a lot of control. I see some more color down here, but I've actually got a little bit more water there. So you can see I've got a bit of a wet on wet effect. So there's another soft edge. Let's go ahead over here and do a tiny bit of color. And in this case, there's a nice, we're going to get a nice hard edge here first, then we're going to soften it. So get that on there, soften it with water. And so we kind of have a hard edge on this side and a soft edge on this side. This petal has a combination of soft and hard edges, and so I'm going to go ahead and add the hard edges first, and then I'm coming in and doing the soft edges. So where I see a hard edge is kind of along here. And then I'm going to come in with my water and soften along the top. So along the bottom edge of this shadow shape, it's a nice hard edge, and along the top edge, it's soft. And so I'm coming in and just softening that all along the top. And I'm going to drag that up a little bit. I actually have another hard edge over here I'm going to deal with in a minute. I'm going to drag this up. I don't mind having a few kind of lines, almost, if you will, here. I'm going to drag my color in again, just for a little bit of detail. My paper is pretty damp, and that's allowing that detail to show. That's something to know as well. When you do this technique, your paper will typically be wet enough that you'll have an easier time getting detail. However, as I said, you do need to work quickly. I'm just going to come in, and there's, like I say, a nice hard edge along that area of this petal as well. And again, I'll just drag that color down, make sure I've got everything nice and blended how I want it. And there is a little bit of soft edge shadow along the top of here. I can put that on if I'm really careful that I don't wet my hard edge. So stay away from my hard edge and just soften that a little bit. And so I'm just going to go over the rest of this flower looking for my hard and soft edges. I'm applying that pigment first, then where the edges need to be soft, I'm using a clean, kind of a damp, slightly wet brush and just softening that edge and then moving on to another shape. Applying some color, softening the edge, and then moving on to another shape. And when I come across a hard edge, I just get that paint on there and leave it alone. You can see how I switch back and forth between hard edges and soft edges for the details of this flower. Once I've dried this, I have the option of pushing my techniques even further by coming in with a second layer and doing exactly the same thing. I've got my normal shadow color here, and I also have a more purple color. So I'm going to just repeat those steps using these two colors so that I get added interest and deeper values in some places. And sometimes I might even come back in and use something like a wet on wet technique where things are already wet and I want to push my shadows a bit darker. I can even just put my darker color directly onto the wet area that I've already applied that pinky color, then I just come in with a little bit more purple. So for the rest of these petal details, I'm just going to be moving between these three techniques: wet on dry with softened edges, as well as wet on dry to maintain my hard edges until I'm happy with the final result. But I want to inspire you with just how powerful these techniques really are by showing you how I use them in my most intricate florals. This peony is an example of hard and soft edges at play again and again. So if you look at this petal here, you can definitely see there's quite a few, what you would almost say is like soft but slightly crisp little lines happening, right? Or same with this one here. And this is a great time to either use a wet on wet technique where you've let the paper get a little bit drier so that's maybe more damp than wet. You don't want to be sopping wet. These would just absolutely disappear. So as the paper's drying, you could use a wet on wet technique and do some of these little details, or you could absolutely come in while it's dry, grab your pink or whatever color you're painting with, right? And apply those and then very quickly soften them with water. So you could use a wet on wet technique that's a little more on the dry side or damp side, or you could use the wet on dry technique where you're very quickly, after you've applied that pink, you're softening it with your brush. On the other hand, these shapes here are definitely hard edged, as you can tell, where I would have been applying the paint just within that section there and then dropping a little bit of a darker color. So you can see I've got two colors going, right? The pink and the purpley blue color. And so you'd want to be able to maintain those nice hard edges. And that's where you would work with that, only that shape being wet, and then drop that color in there. So you get a hard edge with a little bit of a wet on wet effect. And so that's how I would have created all the drama that's in these shadows. I would have painted one shadow shape at a time when the paper was 100% dry so that I'd have these nice crisp lines around the edges. And then I'd come in and drop some pigment just within the wet shape. So we've got nice hard edges here and then nice soft transitionings happening just within the shadow shape. So you can see how kind of going back and forth between first using wet on wet and then coming in with wet on dry and softening things, or coming in wet on dry and just keeping things within a nice hard edge shape. You can get so much happening and get such complexity, but you're just using those same three techniques again and again and again. The same thing with this pansy here. I would have been working with damp techniques, whether I was working wet on wet or applying that paint and just quickly softening the edges with my damp brush. I would have been doing this shape while things were damp. Whereas these strong details on the pansy, those would have to go on when everything is fully dry so that you get these nice, crisp, and very sharp edges to the little details. This rose is definitely a time you'd want to be able to apply the technique of putting your paint on dry, but then very quickly softening the edges. For instance, you might have a very small shape like this and you really want to control it. That would be a great time to be able to just apply that shape with a nice light pink and then have a damp brush right next to you that you can very quickly start softening the edge there. Same with this nice edge along here. You could come in with that nice purple color and then very quickly soften it with your clean damp brush. Do you see that? And so there's a lot of, this painting's a little smaller than the others, and so that's where it can be really helpful to be able to use that technique. Although you can see some of these shadows are hard edged, so all I would do is come in with the paint when the painting is dry, right? Come in, paint in that section, don't touch it, let it dry. Whereas in some situations, even here, this looks like I slightly softened that edge, barely, but it looks slightly softened. Or here, that looks slightly softened. Even here is slightly softened, whereas here it hasn't been softened. It's a nice crisp hard edge, right? And so you can see it's just a matter of varying your edges, soft versus hard. Just remember, any time that you need a hard edge, you want your paper to be fully dry before you apply the paint, and so that you'll be able to maintain that hard edge. Whereas something like this shape here, you really could go over everything with clear water first and then lay down that shape onto the slightly damp paper. That would be an option. But like I say, either way works, but it's definitely got a nice soft edge and it's a small shape. And so that's where you have options. And finally, in this area where everything is nice and dry, we have some hard edges where these little stamen are coming and casting a shadow. And so I'm going to go ahead and draw some of these little lines that kind of come down. And they're basically the shadow of these little stamens. So there's some little lines and then the little dots. Little line, little dot. So there's a bunch of them over here. So I'm just going to paint those in using the wet on dry technique, and I'm not going to be softening any edges. I'm wanting nice hard edges for this part. If I feel like the color is a little too pink, I can just come in with a little bit more purple and deepen them a bit. And if I find any of these shapes are a little bit too harsh, I can just add a little bit of water, just very, very, very lightly. So I'm kind of going back and forth between my pinks, my purple, and a little bit of water when I feel like the purple is maybe getting a little bit too stark. But I'm staying within the shapes of the stamen because I don't want to end up having these all soften out and disappearing completely, right? If you're enjoying this project and would like to see how I add the final details and background to this, be sure to subscribe so that you can see the flower center, leaves, and background come together. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye.